January 8, 2026. California's governor walks into the state capitol knowing these are his final moments as the most powerful man in America's largest economy. What he says next will either make or destroy his shot at the White House. He's betting $42 billion on artificial intelligence money that might not exist next year. He's declaring war on a sitting president. And he's selling a version of California that millions of residents don't recognize anymore. This isn't a farewell speech. This is the opening move in the most controversial presidential campaign of 2028. And the numbers he's hiding could bring down everything he's building. Governor Gavin Newsom stood before California's legislature for over an hour Thursday, delivering what he called a State of the State address. But everyone in that chamber knew what they were really watching. This was a presidential audition. Newsom is term limited. He leaves office in January 2027, less than a year from now, and every single line of his speech was crafted not for Sacramento, but for Democratic primary voters across America. He positioned California as a beacon of democracy, standing against federal chaos. He announced 52 lawsuits against the Trump administration, claiming those legal battles saved $168 billion in federal funding. Then came the money talk that changed everything. Newsom declared California's revenues came in $42.3 billion higher than originally forecast over the last 3 years. He attributed this windfall almost entirely to the artificial intelligence boom driving stock market gains. He proposed putting $7.3 billion back into reserves and projected a total state budget of $248.3 billion. Education got massive promises. $350 million more for UC, $365 million more for Cal State, full funding for universal kindergarten, an additional $1 billion for high-need schools, per pupil spending rising to $2,700. He announced plans to move control of the Department of Education under the executive branch, giving the governor significantly more direct power over schools. Then he went after Trump. Hard. Secret police, Newsom said. Businesses raided, citizens detained, masked men snatching people in broad daylight. California, he declared, would be the antidote to this chaos. Democrats applauded, Republicans immediately attacked. But here's what nobody was saying out loud. The actual budget numbers released the very next morning told a completely different story. There are 3 colliding forces that explain why this speech happened the way it did, and each reveals something deeply unstable about California's future. First, the AI revenue gamble. California's budget is heavily dependent on capital gains taxes from stock sales. When tech stocks boom, state coffers overflow. When they crash, revenues collapse overnight. That $42 billion windfall comes almost entirely from artificial intelligence companies and related stock market gains. Think about what that means. California is betting its entire fiscal future on an industry that didn't exist in its current form 3 years ago. OpenAI, Anthropic, dozens of AI startups generating massive valuations. Investors cashing out. Capital gains taxes flooding into Sacramento. This is not a stable revenue source. This is a bubble economy funding government operations. If AI hype cools, if stock valuations correct, if investors stop cashing out, that $42 billion evaporates instantly. And every promise Newsom just made collapses with it. Second, the federal funding cliff nobody wants to discuss. Newsom bragged about saving $168 billion through lawsuits, but he barely mentioned the federal cuts already locked in and coming. Starting in October 2026, the federal government will cut Medicaid funding for certain immigrants. New federal guidelines will limit tax revenue. California can collect from medical insurance providers, costing at least $2 billion annually. California accounted for $3.3 billion of $8 billion in federal energy funding cuts, already announced by the Trump administration. These aren't hypothetical losses. They're real, they're scheduled, they're baked into the fiscal reality Sacramento will face in coming months. Newsom's budget assumes some of these cuts won't take effect on schedule. That's extraordinarily optimistic when the federal government is actively hostile to California's priorities. Third, the budget shortfall nobody's talking about. The day after Newsom's triumphant speech, the Department of Finance released the actual budget proposal. It projects a $2.9 billion shortfall for the upcoming fiscal year. That's better than the $18 billion gap some analysts feared, but it's still a deficit. And it comes after California swung from a $97.5 billion surplus in 2022 to a $68 billion deficit in 2023. That's a $165 billion reversal in just 18 months. The state's finances are volatile in ways that make long-term planning nearly impossible. Here's where Newsom's strategy reveals itself, and where the risks become impossible to ignore. His optimistic projections assume three things: continued AI-driven revenue growth, stable federal funding despite political hostility, and no major economic shocks. Those are enormous assumptions, and if any one of them fails, the entire structure collapses. Best case scenario, the AI boom holds. Tech companies keep raising money at high valuations. Capital gains taxes keep flowing. The $42 billion windfall becomes the new normal. California fully funds its promises. Newsom leaves office on a high note. His presidential campaign launches with a track record of success. This is possible, but it requires everything to go right. No stock market correction, no recession, no tech bubble burst, no disruptions. Base case scenario, managed decline. AI revenues continue, but slow down. The $42 billion windfall shrinks to something more sustainable, maybe $20 billion, maybe less. The $2.9 billion budget shortfall grows to $8 or $10 billion. Sacramento makes cuts, but not drastic ones. Some education promises get delayed. Federal funding losses force service reductions. California muddles through. The state doesn't collapse, but the optimistic narrative doesn't materialize either. But Newsom's presidential pitch gets significantly harder. He's selling California as a successful model while his successor is cutting budgets and managing deficits. Worst case scenario, the AI bubble pops. AI valuations prove massively inflated. A market correction hits tech stocks hard. Capital gains tax revenue collapses. That $42 billion windfall disappears. California faces a deficit not of $2.9 billion, but of $30 or $40 billion. Emergency cuts sweep across state government. Education funding gets slashed. Social services get cut. The federal funding losses hit at exactly the wrong time. The state burns through reserves in months. California's credit rating takes a hit. A fiscal crisis emerges. In this scenario, Newsom's presidential ambitions die. He becomes associated with fiscal mismanagement and over-promising. California becomes a cautionary tale, not a model. The credibility gap is already widening. Newsom touted a 9% reduction in unsheltered homelessness. Lawmakers were restrained in their response. They know what voters see on the streets every day. Politico published an analysis titled, "For Gavin Newsom, Selling California May Be Harder Than It Looks." The Los Angeles Times focused on how the budget banks on strong revenues despite fiscal risks. Cal Matters asked, "Is it real?" The skepticism isn't just from Republicans. It's from non-partisan budget analysts who've watched California's boom and bust cycles before. The gap between what Newsom says California is and what residents actually experience keeps growing wider. That credibility gap will define his ability to sell California's model nationally. Because voters in Iowa and New Hampshire don't just hear political speeches. They see viral videos of California's homeless crisis. They hear stories about businesses leaving the state. They know people who've moved away citing costs and quality of life. You can pay attention to specific indicators that will tell you which scenario is unfolding. Watch the quarterly revenue reports. If capital gains taxes start coming in below forecast, that's your early warning signal. Monitor tech sector layoffs and funding rounds. Track federal funding battles and court decisions. Follow the budget negotiations between now and June. This speech wasn't really about California's budget. It was about Newsom's next act. Every line was crafted for a presidential campaign, but the budget reality he's leaving behind will determine whether that campaign succeeds or fails. Here's the question that matters. Do you believe California's AI-driven revenue boom is sustainable? Or are we watching the setup for the next budget crisis? Are you paying attention to the actual numbers or just the political rhetoric? The next year will reveal whether Newsom's final speech was prophecy or fantasy, and whether California voters were sold a vision that can actually survive reality.